So we're picking up with the mid portion of the novel, chapters 10 through 30, and that takes us to through the end of part 1 of the novel and into part 2 of the novel. So the midsection there, it's kind of hard to cover the middle of a novel because you're trying not to reveal to those who haven't finished it how things end. So on the hopes that you will get it finished by the time our regular face-to-face class begins this week, I'm going to talk a little bit about the material in the middle of the novel, but I'm also going to set the stage for discussions, at least some big questions, towards the end. Now, never fear, if you want to stop this lecture, online lecture, a little bit before the end so that I don't give away any spoilers, that's okay, because with this particular lecture, I'm going to embed the quiz questions in the middle of the lecture. So you got to listen very carefully. There's going to be 2 quiz questions that I'm going to offer up, and you got to send them by email no later than Tuesday at midnight to my email address. So you got to be listening throughout the entire lecture to pick up the 2 quiz questions that you'll be sending me by Tuesday at midnight. I'm not going to put it at the end like I always do because you might not want to listen to the very end if you haven't finished. Anyway, here we go. So I'm mostly going to want to raise questions in this particular online lecture, questions that I think are pertinent to what we're trying to achieve in the class as a whole. Pardon me. First of all, I want to talk about this work as obviously adolescent fiction. It is, of course, probably the most famous work of adolescent fiction in American literature. And as a genre, it's interesting because it's geared primarily towards one gender, females, young females, just like Rosen was, as we talked about in class. And there's a lot of talk about whether or not this novel provides what one would call a framework for female empowerment. While that is something that we can debate and discuss, I think you could probably make a great case on both sides of it. So the question would be, in what ways could this be said to, if not fully empower, at least equip young women? I think it's what Rosen's trying to do, perhaps, in that novel. This one's a little bit more overt about that, and it's not so focused only on one issue, which is sex and marriage, although it is. And you're going to see us get to that here in just a little bit. But it's dealing with things like social expectations, moral norms, the cultivation of virtue. So in a way, it kind of acts as a how-to book, functions as a how-to book. Not for working class girls, not for upper class girls, although to some extent. These are middle class young women. It shows you how tenuous a grasp people had on middle class status in the era. It was very, very easy to fall from middle class, and there was nothing below to catch you. And so that is always on the mind of the March family because of their unfortunate circumstances financially earlier on because of the father's decision to help others. They are always in a precarious financial situation, and that is in the background. That's always the threat that's in the back of their minds. Where's money going to come from next? So they're very much about the middle class. We'll talk about that in a moment as well. But this is kind of offering, through episodic little vignettes, almost reads like you would view a sitcom in a way, right? With little episodes. You can see how this lent itself very well to serialization. That was a very common thing back in the day, either initially or or after a novel was published, but more often before a novel was published, is that a writer would submit a chapter a week to a newspaper or a periodical or even a monthly periodical. You would submit a chapter per issue and you'd be paid for that. And Dickens wrote many of his works that way, serialized. And it kept the reader going, kept them subscribing to the magazine or the newspaper, so they loved it, and it kept cash coming. So you didn't have to wait a whole year before your book came out and you got paid. You could eat every month. And so you can see how this lends itself very well to that. Every chapter is about, once you've established the characters, every chapter is about another episode, another adventure, and by the time you're into the novel, by about chapter 10 or 11, you know the characters so well that you almost can predict how they're going to behave, how they're going to react, and but on the other hand, every time there's an episode, you reveal one more little piece about that person's character. So there's a really interesting. So whether it's the play plan that they have that falls apart, and what about this? We don't have to do chores. We can just play and do chores when we get around to it, kind of thing. Well, that didn't work out very well. Or it could be the situation where Jo loses her manuscript and has to control her temper a little bit, and decide what's most important, my sister or my manuscript, something of that nature. The parties, how do we dress when we don't have nice dresses? What do we do? Forgiveness. The Jo's hair episode, which is a huge thing. Mr. March gets sick. They've got to figure out how to get Marmee to see him. They don't have a lot of money. She goes out and sells her hair. That was a very drastic thing to do for a young woman at the time. I mean, if a young woman, her hair was extremely important, to sell your hair. And everybody knew that if you sold your hair, you were pretty desperate for money. It just wasn't something you did. Short hairstyles were just not something that anybody ever did. Of course, there was a demand for hair for wigs and things of this nature. But, it was, if you cut your hair, man, it was a drastic thing to do. And of course, one of her sisters says, Jo, how could you? It was your your one beauty. Oh, that's kind of a backhanded compliment, wasn't it? So all of these little episodes for the mid portion of the novel are designed to kind of illustrate how these girls are becoming little women, right? How they're growing up. What are the virtues and values that are being instilled in them, etc. And there's a fine balancing act between developing independence, which the novel indicates is a really important thing. I would argue that Rowson's novel does not value independence, not particularly. So here's quiz question number 1. Why does Jo sell her hair? Okay, that's quiz question number 1. Jot that one down. Be ready to send that to me by email, okay? The independence that's being emphasized here, there's even a passage at the end of one of the chapters where it talks about how important independence was to Jo. Maybe more so to Jo than the other girls, but certainly to Jo. And it's championed in this novel, which is kind of newish. So before you sit there and go, this is all a bunch of hokey moralizing and, I learned my lesson kind of stuff that you would see in a 1940s or 50s serial or movie or sitcoms of some sort early on. Number 1, it's for children, it's for kids. Number 2, it's a simpler age. Number 3, despite all the sort of conventional morality, it is emphasizing something that previous novels didn't so much for girls, and that is independence as a value and as a virtue. Okay, but it has to balance that with the temptation for an independent young woman to flout social convention. That doesn't pay. You don't do well doing that, right? Remember they're going and paying their respects and doing their calls or social calling. That, by the way, that was something that women did, middle-class women did all the time. Okay, you would go by someone's house and you would leave a card if they weren't there or they weren't able to take you in, and you would visit. This is how women would not gossip, but they would catch it. They would reinforce their social circles. Okay, in a town, you were expected to call on your friends, and of course they didn't have any telephones or no internet, no texting, none of that kind of junk. And so they would come around on a given day and they would do their social calls. And they might spend 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour. They might spend the whole day doing it with several of their friends. If somebody wasn't in, you'd leave your card, and your card would say basically who you were, and that would let them know, oh, she came by and I wasn't here, and that's fine. Okay, but it was a social obligation to see how your neighbors were doing, to catch up on news, and just to stay in touch and stay bonded. And that was an important thing. Today, it's kind of not that big of a deal. Well, here's Jo acting like basically nothing better than a horse's rear end, being a jerk, and you can't do that. That's not good. You shouldn't do that. I mean, are these social calls kind of a silly sort of convention? Yeah, they are, but they serve a purpose. And the purpose is not stupid. And so, in life, you should be independent, but you shouldn't be obnoxiously so. And you can flout some conventions, but some conventions exist for reasons. So it's a bit of a playbook, a how-to book on how to function and navigate in the social world. Can you tell it's serialized? Each chapter, like I said, is like a sitcom and so on. Well, I want to get into some of the other questions about it. And one of the central questions that I want to tackle in class particularly is this. I think it raises a very big, serious question here. How does one live a happy and fulfilling life within the arbitrary confines of social customs and norms, especially gender customs and norms? In other words, how do you live a fulfilling life when the society you're living in has some, rather arbitrary guidelines and sort of guardrails and makes you color within the lines, if you will, when you don't feel like that you fit into that? Jo's a really unconventional young girl, and she kind of doesn't fit. You saw this really seriously with Margaret Fuller. Obviously, this is not a Margaret Fuller situation, but Jo's a very independent-spirited person. By the end of the novel, I want to ask this question. Do you think Jo found a happy middle ground with her spirit on the one hand and her need to live in a world according to practical, pragmatic considerations? I don't know. We'll see. Some people like what happens at the end. Some people don't. Secondly, how do we and the readers of the time feel about the Amy-Laurie match? Okay, so I'm kind of ruining it for you a little bit because you get to see in this segment Meg get married, and it's Mr. Brooke. And by the way, I'm sorry, but it is kind of creepy that he kept her glove. It's just kind of weird. So that's quiz question number two. How does, here's the question. It's not whether he kept her glove. He did keep her glove, obviously. How does Meg find out? How does Meg find out that he has her glove? That's quiz question number two. How does she find that out? That's because that's an interesting sort of thing there. And we get to see Meg falling in love with Mr. Brooke, but it's not like a love at first sight thing. She's younger than he is. Is his relationship with her inappropriate? Oh, I guess the age difference isn't that big. Okay, it's not that awful. Maybe different if he's like 35. And he recognizes that she's young and she's very naive and she's very innocent and he may need to wait. And certainly the biggest consideration is he's got to wait because he's actually got to make a living somehow. And that was an important thing. That happened a lot in the 19th century. A young man simply could not go and ask a girl to marry him unless he had a steady income. You wouldn't dream of a young man marrying a girl unless he was able to provide for her and himself altogether, because there was no social safety net. You just didn't do that. Can you imagine back in the day? Well, you couldn't imagine. Back in the day, you couldn't imagine, a couple getting married and him going to school and continuing to go to school while she worked. That would simply just be an unacceptable situation for everyone involved. No parents would give their blessing. I think this is a great little quote here when we're talking about independence. Louisa May Alcott said, "I like to help women help themselves, as that is, in my opinion, the best way to settle the woman question." And the woman question at the time was, what sort of rights should women have in a democratic and free society? And she says, I want to help women help themselves, because I think that's the best way to answer this question of what should women's roles be in the society. Whatever we can do and do well, we have a right to do. And I don't think anyone will deny us. This is a period of time where obviously the primary political issue is slavery, right? 1860s, 70s, 80s. But also woven with that, hand in hand with that, was the question of women's rights. Now, the issue of slavery gets resolved by a civil war and pretty dramatically and swiftly, though the aftermath of that certainly didn't lead to outright freedom. That we all know that. But the women's question almost gets put off until the 19 teens even. When the women's suffrage movement eventually leads to the 19th Amendment in 1920. So these are some interesting questions that I think should be explored. Now I'm going to skip ahead. If you don't want to see this because you don't want spoilers, that's fine. Remember our two quiz questions, right? Why'd Jo cut her hair? And then the other question is, how does Meg find out about the glove situation, right? Who tells her? How's it revealed to her? Creepy as it is. Okay, so what I want to do in our Thursday class, and I'm kind of foreshadowing this because it's kind of hard not to skip ahead in the novel, sorry, is to talk a little bit about marriage and social class. And I'm just going to raise a few things here. The upward mobility of women was almost entirely dependent upon marriage arrangements. In other words, you didn't really advance in social class or economic standing outside of marriage if you were a woman. Some did. But starting your own business, for example, making your fortune, simply wasn't something that many women did. If you did do it, you did it largely through a profession like writing, which was not sort of looked at very positively. It was kind of almost frowned on in some social circles, in some more conservative, traditional circles. By becoming a career woman, Jo is defying this. And this is not some flaming radical feminist piece. But I think it's not unfair to acknowledge that it is progressive, okay? Maybe it's not as progressive as some people would like, but it is progressive in that sense because it's giving girls an opportunity to say there's more than one path for me in life. And previously, a lot of them were told there's only one path, and that's marriage. And Jo says, that may or may not be for me through much of the novel. But there is a tension here. Will the marriage bond destroy the sibling bond? That's really an interesting question, okay? Jo raises it more than anybody else. Amy's near death, Beth's passing, sorry she dies, Meg's marriage, Marmy's trip to care for the father. The sibling bond, the family, the nuclear family bond is in the eyes of some people, sort of under threat. Well, it's under threat if you're young and you don't understand that things change, but that's what they are. It's a novel about adolescence, okay? Another question, in what ways are we shown in this novel that marriage can potentially retard the personal, spiritual, or intellectual growth of women? That is a threat, right? There's the money threat, there's the destruction of the family threat, and oh gosh, change, that's a scary thing for families. There's another threat, and that is the threat that if I get married, is that going to stifle my life? Am I going to not be able to reach my full potential? Okay. Jo's marriage to Professor Bear. See, told you, spoiler. Too bad. Is it problematic? This is what I want to know. I'll raise this in class. Did Louisa May Alcott cave? I mean, she is adamant that she's not going to have Jo marry Laurie and give the readers the kind of stereotypical, it's what every 12-year-old girl, 15-year-old girl reading the novel wants to happen. Oh, I hope she marries Laurie. And she's like, I'm not going to give you that. No. Remember, it's a novel about growing up. And not everything happens like a little romance novel, these schlocky romance novels where, she's not going to give you the Disney princess thing, okay? But she does have her marry this German professor. Does she cave in doing that? Should Jo actually be someone who gets married? I've heard great arguments on both sides. We'll see what you think when we get to class, okay? What about Amy also? What does her experience traveling in Europe demonstrate? Does she change for the better? She certainly grows up a lot, doesn't she? She really does. And we'll talk a little bit about what ends up happening. Of course, sorry, another spoiler. Guess who she marries? Yeah, you know. Is that a good marriage? I mean, you didn't see it coming in the early part of the novel. Two things you didn't see coming. You saw Meg getting married, but you didn't know to whom. However, she marries a guy that kind of early on, they have some difficulty because they're not perfectly matched. He can't provide what she's expecting. So that's a toughie, right? So she doesn't marry the kind of person that you would stereotypically think she would, or that you might on the surface think she needs. Jo marries, and you don't even think that Jo's going to marry early on. Or if she does, we're going to have to pull this Laurie thing out. Well, Louisa is against that. She doesn't want to do that. And then you got Amy, and Amy's such a baby that can't imagine her getting married in the early part of the novel. Look at what the novel's about. The novel's about change. It's about growth. It's about navigating different dichotomies. And in that sense, it's not a baby book for little girls. It's not. It's about, now, is it about, deep, heavy philosophical things? Well, perhaps not from our perspective, but remember, we're not 14-year-old girls. who on a maturity level in these days is probably more like 12. We're not, okay? So let's don't be unfair to the novel, but at the same time, there are some reasons to be potentially critical. I've always felt that Jo probably shouldn't have gotten married. She shouldn't have, she shouldn't have had Jo get married. But maybe Louisa felt like, no, I need to have that happen because I need to show that even an independently spirited and independent, career-oriented woman can get married. You don't have to choose spinsterhood. Okay, she doesn't have to, right? So maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. We'll see what you guys think about these questions. Remember the 2 questions that are embedded in this video, the quiz questions. Send those to me by Tuesday at midnight. I'm not going to have a discussion post this week, so there won't be a need to do that. Just send me the quiz questions. We'll continue the discussion in class on Thursday. Thanks.